What is going on, guys? Christopher O'Toole here with you guys today, and in this video I'm going to be talking about filmmaking for absolute beginners, okay? I'm going to be talking about the absolute basics, the absolute just basics of filmmaking. I guess I just said that twice, but anyways, I'm going to be talking about the absolute basics of filmmaking, okay? What is film? What do you need to get into filmmaking? And my advice for beginning as an absolute beginner filmmaker, even if it's for yourself, if you're shooting for your travel vlogs, if you travel, or whatever you may be doing, I'm going to be talking about all of those things. So, beginning with the absolute basics of filmmaking, the very basic thing, the very fundamental thing, which is, what is video? This you very likely know, but if you don't, then video is basically where your camera takes a bunch of pictures and then it smashes it all together, and now when you play it back, then it's play however many of those pictures a second, and so it comes across as a video. Now you can change your frame rate or how many pictures your camera takes in a certain second, okay? Now, when people shoot video for movies, for major cinematography, and now most vlogs are shot on this, is the basic standard frame rate for cinematography is 24 frames per second. Okay, more exactly it's 23.976 frames per second. There's a long story behind that. Started years ago, back in the day, you know, in filmmaking, when we used film cameras, the early 1900s or something like that, they had some problem. By changing it to 23.976, it would fix the problem. Don't ask me for a better explanation. I may give one later on. So this is the basic frame rate for America. Now, there are other basic frame rates for, like, Korea. There's 25 frames per second, I believe. But anyways, the basic frame rate is 24 frames per second. There's also 30 frames per second, which is technically 29.97 frames per second, then 60 frames per second, and so on. There's 120, 240, whatever it may be. But that is basically what video is, and you can change that video. Now, you may be asking, what would be the point of shooting in 60 frames per second or 120 or something like that? Well, that will be for slow motion, okay? Now, basically, how you shoot slow motion is you turn up your frame rate, and then in a video editing software, you'd be able to slow that video down, because instead of 24 frames per second, it's spitting out 60, and so you can stretch that video out. Now, I've heard a lot of different things about what frame rate we see in as humans. I personally think that we see in a bunch of different frame rates depending on the person. I've heard it said that we see at 24, 30, I believe 30. I've heard it said that, and I've heard it said that we see in 60. I personally see in 60, but whatever it is, the base video shooting for cinematography is 24 frames per second. 30 frames per second. I pretty much never use that unless I'm dealing with a baseline of 30 frames per second. I pretty much never shoot 30 frames per second, and 30 frames per second really isn't a standard in any ways, so I personally don't ever shoot 30 frames per second hardly for cinematography, so I really don't get watched on cameras. It's an embarrassment. There's so much more to taking cinematography than just shooting in 24 frames per second, okay? One of those things is shutter speed, okay? Now, I've discussed shutter speed before, but what shutter speed is how long your shutter stays open for. And basic shutter speed for video is twice your frame rate, okay? Now you may be asking, why is it that? Well, it's because with twice the frame rate, you will have correct motion blur. Motion blur is when something's moving in the camera or your camera moves and it's blurred, okay? Because the shutter speed is slow enough that it's not catching something still, it's blurring it. And the correct motion blur for your video is useful in so many ways, with helping with transitions or whatever it may be. It just looks more cinematic with a correct motion blur. Now, yes, of course, with a higher frame rate, you will have to have a higher shutter speed and a faster shutter speed, and so you will get less and less motion blur as your frame rate goes up, but that's just something that you'll have to deal with. Now, I could talk about video settings all day long, but that is the very base that you need to know, is having your shutter speed twice your frame rate, because that is the very fundamental thing for shooting film, to have the correct motion blur. Now, basically, we've just scratched the surface with what video is and how to shoot video. Now, next, you may hear of something called resolution. Resolution is basically how many pixels by how many pixels your video camera shoots in, okay? Now, you very likely have heard of 1080. That is the resolution. That's basically the standard. Most people watch YouTube videos on 1080, but anyways, that's basically what it is 1,920 pixels by 1,080 pixels, hence the term 1080. And so that is technically full high definition. Yes, you can go down to high definition, which is 1,280 by 720 pixels, but that is just low res, that's really not being used anymore. Now, resolution is basically just a word for how many pixels by how many pixels your video is, okay? And what is the resolution of your video, okay? There's 4K resolution, there's 8K resolution, and things of all that nature. But basically, resolution is just the quality of video that you're shooting in. Now, there's two different types of 4K. You may have heard of 4K DCI or 4K UHD. UHD stands for Ultra High Definition. DCI stands for, I'm not exactly sure what. But 4K DCI is 4,096 pixels by 2,304 pixels. And 4K UHD is 3,840 pixels by 2,160 pixels. Now you may say, wait, 4K, that stands for 4,000. Yes, it does. But, okay, 3,840 pixels, that's pretty much 4,000. That's almost 4,000. So basically when you hear 4K, it's going to be 4K UHD, which is pretty much 4,000 pixels, okay? It's 160 pixels short of 4,000 pixels. So that's basically 4K video, and that's basically what resolution is. Now, after resolution, we have aspect ratios. What is an aspect ratio? Okay, this, what you're seeing the video in is a 2:1 aspect ratio. That means it's twice as wide as it is tall. Okay, now there are so many different aspect ratios. You have Original, Academy, IMAX, Super Panavision. You have CinemaScope / Panavision. You have Cinerama and MGM 65, which is pretty much not used in cinema anymore. It's just an old aspect ratio that they used to shoot with stuff like the old Ben-Hur, things of that nature, really wide. But all these are aspect ratios. They just have names for them. Okay, now you very likely have heard of IMAX, which is big in theaters today. That's pretty much what movies are shot on these days, is IMAX. Well, IMAX has an aspect ratio of 1.43 to 1. Okay, basically that's for every 1 pixel it is tall, is 1.43 pixels wide. Okay, so basically if it's 1,000 pixels tall, it's 1,430 pixels wide. Now that's extremely wide and extremely tall. Basically for the past however many years, the thing that's been seen as most cinematic is 235 by 1. Okay, that means for every 1 pixel tall is 2.35 pixels wide. Okay, so again, if it's 1,000 pixels tall, it's 2,350 pixels wide. But aspect ratios can be so different, and basically DSLR cinematography, unless you're using an anamorphic lens, which basically just stretches your video out, it's going to be video in a 16:9 format. Now, you may be wondering, why is it 16:9? Well, because back in the day, when some movies were still being shot on a 4:3 aspect ratio, and then you had wider screen aspect ratios, they just basically said, we just need to create a standard aspect ratio that would kind of fit both. And so they settled on 16:9 because it'll basically have widescreen bars on the top and bottom if it's widescreen, or it'll have bars on the sides if it's 4:3. So basically, all DSLRs, I believe, film in 16:9 as their normal filming, which is every 16 pixels wide is 9 pixels tall. So that's just basically what aspect ratio is. It's basically the aspect ratio of the video. Now that you know the very basics of videoing and what video is, what aspect ratios are, what frame rates are, all this stuff, what do you need to get into filmmaking, you may be asking? And these are the things that you absolutely need, okay? Now I suggest, as I'll go into in a minute, I'll suggest a lot more things than these very basic things, but these are the things you absolutely need to get into filmmaking. And number one is a camera. You need a camera. Number two is a lens, okay? Now there are expensive lenses and there are cheap lenses. I would look into them, look into ratings on Amazon, whatever they are, but just know that very often lenses are going to be, unless you buy a really pretty expensive camera, lenses are going to be just as expensive as your camera, okay? A good lens is. It completely depends on lenses, but very often they'll be more expensive than your camera. So just know that when you go to buy a lens, okay? $50 lenses are not worth the buy, okay? Usually because they're just not very good. I'll talk more about cheap lenses in this video, but usually they're just very cheaply made, very cheap quality of image that comes out of them, and they're just not a good choice to buy. It's better to save up money and go with the expensive one than to just buy a cheap one. Now, also you need storage. Now there are a few different types of storage. SD cards is what a lot of cameras shoot on, but then with more and more we're heading towards CF Express cards, which can write information on those cards a lot faster. Okay, they can write a lot more information on them, so you can shoot higher frame rates and higher resolutions at the same time. Whereas with an SD card, you may not be able to do that. And also, of course, you need something to edit all these videos. If you're doing filmmaking for yourself, at least. So a computer with a software, there are many good softwares out there. Final Cut. You have things like Avid, or like I use DaVinci Resolve. There are so many different things that you can use to edit your video, but you need a video editor. So that should be kind of obvious. It should be a given, but I just want to throw all those things out there so you can think about them. And then there are also things that I strongly suggest getting. And number one is a tripod. Tripods basically just hold your camera. Mine's holding my camera right now, but basically they're just 3 legs and they hold your camera, and so you can video completely stable with them. Next would be a Steadicam or a gimbal. Now, a Steadicam basically is a device where you hold a handle, and then the camera goes on top, and then the counterweight on the bottom helps steady the video out so it will be near shaky. Now, a gimbal is something that electronically stabilizes your video while you're holding the gimbal, and the gimbal will have something that electronically keeps it stable. You may be running, you may be whatever. It's going to definitely help you out shooting a lot smoother video. Another thing that I would definitely suggest getting is lens filters. I have talked about this so many times on my channel, and that is because I think it is so essential. Lens filters are an absolute, I'd almost put them in a must, except you can take videos without them in a lot of circumstances. But say something like an ND or CPL filter. Basically what an ND filter does is, if you're shooting on a very hot day, of course, on a very bright day, and you have your ISO all the way down at 100, and you have your aperture at basically as low as it can get, because you want to keep that depth of field there, and you have your shutter speed twice your frame rate, it's still way too bright, then guess what? It's still going to be too bright. What do? Well, you throw an ND filter on there, and that brings everything down. Now, of course, in dark situations, you won't be needing this, but just lens filters, just look into them. Also with these, don't go and buy cheap ones. There are lens filters at $250. It's nuts how expensive they are. But just don't go for cheap, but you can go for fairly cheap. Okay, if I've seen a $5 ND filter. It was bad, of course. Just using lens filters can really boost the quality of your video in so many circumstances. And last of all that I'm going to discuss, there are of course a lot more things that you can get to help you out with filmmaking, but the last thing that I'm going to be discussing is extra batteries, okay? Extra batteries is very essential because most batteries do not last 2 hours. Unless you have an extended battery that goes on the whole bottom of your camera and it's just a huge battery, your little battery that you stick into your camera really isn't going to last that long. So taking extra batteries with you will definitely be a big plus, because when one runs out, you can use your second one. And if you're going on an all-day shoot, then you will definitely be using more than one battery, because your camera will be on a lot of the time, even when you're not videoing, and so it'll be constantly draining battery, and so you'll definitely be wanting extra batteries to go with your filming equipment. Now, my advice when you get into filmmaking would definitely have to be, number one, know your camera, okay? Get to know all the settings on your camera. Know it like the back of your hand. Know what situations to do when. Adjusting the white balance, all these types of things. And definitely another thing that I would say will be know the frame rate that you're shooting at, okay? Because shooting the wrong frame rate can absolutely be detrimental to your filmmaking, because say you shoot 24 and you were supposed to shoot 60 or 120, and so you can't really slow it down. Yes, there are softwares that can fake slowing it down, but it's not as good as actually shooting slow motion. So, knowing what your frame rate, knowing your camera would absolutely be imperative to me to start filmmaking. Now, another thing that I would say is, whether it be on YouTube or specific film classes out there, watch other people's videos on how to filmmake, and get to know filmmaking through other people who have been it and who have gone where you've gone before you. And so you can really help your filmmaking out like that. So that is it for me today. I hope you guys like this video. I hope it was helpful to you guys. If you guys do like this video, click that like button down below. If you have any questions or comments, if I left something out, maybe, then drop them in the comments down below. And if you like filmmaking tutorials and photography tutorials, click that subscribe button. And I will see you guys in the next video. Long live the camera.